The puppy froze. Before him stood a huge, gaunt dog, its yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. One step, one wrong move, and it could all be over. It had already started to growl, but suddenly... But let's start from the very beginning. The night was as black as a bottomless abyss. The wind howled like 1,000 hungry wolves, and the snow lashed the ground, turning it into an endless frozen wasteland. It felt as if nature itself had unleashed its fury, flinging open the icy gates of its wrath. Darkness blended with the swirling blizzard, blurring the boundaries of the world. The roaring wind sounded like furious, tormented cries. A small puppy, a tiny bundle of fur, huddled against his mother's side, trying to escape the dreadful cold. His trembling nose burrowed into her damp fur, and his tiny paws clung to her desperately. Her breath was the last warmth in this icy void, her scent, the last hope. Every gust of wind carried fear, but as long as she was there, the puppy knew he was safe. But then, something changed. A sudden gust of wind sent a flurry of snow into the air, blinding them. The sharp crack of a breaking branch echoed through the storm's wail, and his mother's head snapped up. The puppy felt her body tense, her ears twitching as if listening to something unseen. Her breathing turned sharp, uneasy. And then the storm struck with even greater force. A whirlwind of snow spun around them, turning the night into an endless white chaos. The wind drowned out her voice, tearing apart the warmth that connected them. The puppy saw only his mother's silhouette, and then, suddenly, it began to blur, to dissolve into the swirling snow. She lunged forward, her paws slipping on the ice, but the storm was stronger. She was gone, leaving nothing but emptiness behind. The puppy let out a plaintive whimper. He leapt forward, but his tiny paws sank into the snow, his heart pounding so fast it felt like it would burst from his chest. He spun in circles, staring into the blinding darkness, crying out for her. His voice merged with the howling wind, lost in the white abyss. Every snowflake stabbed at his tiny body like needles, and the cold seeped deep into his bones. Everything around him fell silent, trapping him in terrifying loneliness. Her voice was gone. The puppy was alone in the vast, frozen emptiness, in the midst of the raging storm that had stolen his mother away. The world had become enormous and hostile, and the only thing left was fear, piercing his heart with every beat. The wind raged on, relentless, and in that white abyss, amidst the swirling chaos, the little puppy took his first step into the unknown. The cold sank its claws into his tiny body, freezing his movements as if 1,000 icy talons were dragging him down. The puppy trudged forward, sinking into the snowdrifts, his legs trembling from exhaustion. Snow clung to his fur, turning it into a wet, frozen shell. Every breath burned his lungs with the frigid air, and hunger twisted his stomach into painful knots. He called for his mother, but only the wind answered, mocking his desperation. He was too young to understand that she wasn't coming back. Her scent was fading, dissolving into the icy vortex, and that terrified him more than anything. He didn't know how long he had been wandering, but his strength was leaving him fast. The sky above was black, speckled with frozen stars, but he barely saw it. His vision blurred. He stumbled and fell, his tiny face sinking into the snow. Lying there was so easy. All he wanted was to close his eyes and sleep. But instinct told him otherwise. Deep inside, a fragile ember of life still flickered. The puppy whimpered, gathered the last of his strength, and forced himself to rise. In the distance, he saw a dark shape, just a faint silhouette of some structure. A barn? A house? He didn't know. He only knew he had to get there. He pushed forward, stumbling, breaking through the snow with his tiny paws. The wind drove him on, as if the storm itself wanted him to keep fighting. At last, he reached his destination. It was an old, crooked barn. The wooden walls were covered in frost, and the doors sagged on their hinges. The puppy squeezed through a gap between the planks and collapsed onto the hard, frozen floor. It wasn't any warmer inside, but at least the wind couldn't reach him. He curled up tightly, trying to warm himself with his own breath. His paws trembled, his ears drooped lifelessly. Darkness crept into his mind. Sleep. Sleep was the only comfort. But that night, the puppy didn't sleep. He lay there, listening to the wind howl beyond the walls, feeling his body slowly give in. He was afraid to close his eyes, afraid that if he did, he might never wake up. And then, a sound. Faint, but real. Someone was out there. The puppy lifted his head, straining to hear with what little strength he had left. A barely perceptible crunch of snow beneath unseen paws made his heart race. He wasn't alone. But was it a friend? Or a new enemy? The dark silhouette drew closer, its shape becoming clearer. It wasn't a human. Standing before him was a large dog, gaunt, with an exhausted gaze, yet powerful legs and yellow eyes that gleamed in the darkness. She sniffed the air, her ears twitching. The puppy froze, unsure of what to do. The dog growled. Low, warning. She was not kind. Her thin body spoke of long days without food. Her fur stuck out in ragged tufts, and her eyes held the raw struggle of survival. There was nothing comforting about her. She was a creature hardened by hunger and desperation, a being whose life depended on strength and split-second decisions. The puppy lowered his head, showing submission, but his heart pounded wildly. He could smell her, a mix of dust, blood, and fear. He knew she could attack at any moment. Her paws were tense, and the muscles beneath her scarred skin quivered with inner conflict, strike or retreat. The dog took a step forward, slow and measured. Her gaze was hollow, yet something flickered within it. Longing, a familiar ache of loneliness. A memory shimmered in her eyes, something distant, nearly forgotten. Perhaps once, she too had been a puppy, trusting and helpless. Then, suddenly, she stopped. She took a deep breath, pulled her ears back, and sat down. She did not attack. A faint hope stirred in the puppy's chest, but he didn't move. He knew that one wrong step could shatter the fragile truce between them. A tense silence hung in the air. The wind rustled through the dry grass, and somewhere in the distance, another dog let out a long, mournful howl. The big dog flinched but did not move. Her eyes remained locked on the puppy, but there was something more than just a threat in them now. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was exhaustion. The puppy let out a quiet whimper, not out of fear, but as a call. There was no response, but he noticed the slight twitch in the dog's eye, the way her paws stiffened, as if something inside her was waging a battle. And yet, she stayed still. The minutes stretched endlessly. The puppy took a risk and stepped forward. One step, then another. He was ready to flee if anything went wrong. The dog watched him. Her breath was heavy, but she did not pull away. She allowed him to come closer. And then, completely unexpectedly, she tilted her head and let out a soft sigh. In that moment, the puppy understood. He was no longer alone. The puppy and the dog sat across from each other. There was tension in the air, but not fear. It was more like anticipation. Neither of them moved. They simply stared at each other, as if trying to understand. Was the other a friend or an enemy? The wind swept across the ground, lifting dry leaves and sending them swirling through the air. The puppy flinched, but didn't back away. His fur bristled slightly, yet he remained in place. The large dog watched his every move intently. She was alert, but not hostile. It was as if she was testing him, gauging whether he was worthy of walking by her side. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, the dog rose to her feet. Her thin body moved smoothly, but there was exhaustion in her movements. She took a step to the side and looked at the puppy once more. It was a gesture that needed no words, a choice. The puppy hesitated. He didn't yet know if he could trust this shadow that had emerged from the darkness. But he knew one thing. Staying here alone was far more dangerous. There were other creatures in the forest. The cold, the hunger. A lone puppy rarely survived in such conditions. He looked at the dog again. She wasn't rushing him, but she wouldn't wait forever. There was no threat in her eyes, only silent expectation. Finally, he rose to his paws and cautiously took a step forward. The dog didn't move, so he took another step, and another. Now they stood side by side. She sniffed him, and he heard her heavy breathing. There was something familiar in it, the warmth of a weary heart that had once beaten in sync with his own. The dog turned and began walking, slowly, steadily. The puppy followed, first hesitantly, then with more confidence. Their steps were light, nearly silent. The darkness wrapped around them, but for the first time in a long while, it didn't scare him. They moved in sync, like two lost souls who had finally found each other. The night was growing colder, but now the cold felt less frightening. Somewhere in the distance, another dog howled. The puppy stopped for a moment, but the large dog didn't even turn her head. She kept walking, undisturbed by the sounds of the night. This was her world, her domain. And now, the puppy was part of it. Together, they walked into the unknown. But for the first time in a long time, the puppy didn't feel alone. They walked through the night, two wanderers bound by loneliness. Dark silhouettes slipping through the tall grass, stepping cautiously over the damp earth. The forest was alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the snap of twigs under their paws, the distant howls of other dogs. But the puppy was no longer afraid. He felt warmth beside him and knew he was not alone. The big dog moved with certainty, as if she knew exactly where their path led. The puppy kept stealing glances at her, studying her stride, the flick of her ears, the rhythm of her breath. Her fur was rough and tattered in places, but now it felt like a fortress, a shield. She walked calmly, yet every step carried a quiet strength. The forest thinned, giving way to an open plain. The night sky stretched out endlessly, stars scattered across its black depths like beacons lighting the way. The puppy slowed, awestruck. He had never seen the sky so vast. The dog stopped beside him and let out a breath. There was something different in her eyes now, understanding. She knew that uncertainty lay ahead, but now she was not walking alone. The puppy lifted his head. For the first time, he felt strength inside himself. He had survived fear, loneliness, and hunger, and now he stood here, beside someone who knew what it meant to fight for survival. They moved forward, the open land before them stretching into an endless world of possibilities. The wind played through their fur, carrying scents of distant places, of new challenges, but there was no fear now. They walked on until they reached a small rise. Below them, the valley shimmered in the silver light of the moon. A river wound through the land, its slow current carving a path through the earth. The puppy inhaled deeply. The air was fresh, thick with moisture, carrying the scent of life. The dog sat and gazed into the distance. Her eyes were no longer empty. There was something steady and unyielding in them now. She had made a choice. She had a companion. The puppy sat beside her, feeling a quiet confidence rise within him. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. He was no longer a lost puppy, no longer weak, no longer alone. He was part of something greater now. The wind picked up, rushing between them like a herald of change. Ahead lay a road full of trials and hopes. But now they had a path, and they walked it together, side by side, toward where a new life began.